How are you guys? Just how are you? At short notice, I realise I haven't done. Oh, well, welcome to Walking in China. I realise I haven't done a lot of videos this year on the battles, and there's a good reason for that. I've kind of got, and right now I decided to just behind on my figure painting. So I'm working. You've seen these, but I haven't really progressed. I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to show you these on my laptop. Well, bear with me. All right. Hang on. Usual. All right. So you've seen these before. They've progressed a bit. So that's what I've been working on, and I'll let this settle down a minute. That's what I've been working on. So far this year, this is the third formation that I've wanted to finish, and I'm a very methodical and systematic kind of person. And it was really important to me that these coming battles, I don't feel a substitute. I wanted to feel the original Guangxi Clique army. Hey, Dave, how are you, mate? Nice to see you here. I did it today at this time mainly for my American viewers and to catch up with my mate Dave. Now then, as you know, I'm trying to work on Guangxi Clique, so I'll show you what the figures are so far. So that, as you know, is a Caesar figure that I'd cut off the head off previously to use that head for another figure. And this is the thing, I keep bodies and torsos. Another figure from the Caesar World War II Chinese with a head swap. I think you've seen most of these, but I've actually got around now to applying the bedroll, blanket rolls, and this army's nowhere near finished yet. So you just have to bear with me. And if you're watching this and you're unhappy with my level of videos, just fuck off and unsubscribe, because I don't do this for money. I do this because I think people might be interested in what I'm doing. And hopefully if I platform my understandings, I might get the odd shout. I go, oh, you're wrong there. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about today, and you might find this interesting, you might not find this interesting, was or is the madness of the Japanese military from 1931 onwards, or from the 20s onwards. Now, what I'm about to say is something that obviously I'm not an academic historian, but I try to bring you unique perspectives, or keep the show unique subjects. And what I want to say today is perhaps a little bit unique, but anyway, I'm going to say it. So, as historians as we watch historians, history docos, we are constantly fed new interpretations and reinterpretations of history, and that's great. I mean, that's what it should be about. But what I want to say is, I watch shows, quite a bit of shows that try to explain or understand Japan, the many elements of the Japanese military. Now, I was once watching one that was, why were the Japanese just so brutal? Why was the Japanese military just so brutally horrible during World War II? And now, what I'm saying is that people try to understand, why did they do this? Why is this? Why is that? But you can't understand madness. And I believe at the very heart of Japanese military doctrine, or I'm looking for a better word, ethos, ideal, um, foundational belief, was the fact that the spirit will always overcome. The martial spirit will always overcome. But when we try to understand madness, we cannot, because we can only understand madness by being rational. Only a madman understands his motives. We can understand the physical or the medical reason for those motives, but the actual thoughts of the madman are his own. Now, there's a lot of areas of this subject that I wanted to cover. And we're going to first start at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. And Japan has built the Russo-Japanese War. And as you know, the Battle of Tsushima is a massive naval engagement between the Japanese and Russian fleet. And of course, it was a massive Japanese victory. Now, that, I'm just trying to look for what was the name? Togo Heihachiro. Now, Admiral Heihachiro advanced to the Russian fleet and turned in front of the Russian guns in order to cross the sea. This meant that all of Japan's fleet was at cataclysmic risk in order to complete the Admiral's order, as every ship had to turn under the Japanese guns. And it was a great victory. And thus was born the Japanese naval doctrine that the fleet and the army should always be prepared for one cataclysmic blow against the enemy that will decide the war. And in order to do that, it must be an all or nothing. As I said, the Admiral turns his fleet under the Russian guns. In other words, you risk everything you have to get that cataclysmic victory. And that becomes the bedrock of Imperial Japanese Navy thought from 1905 onwards. The fleet and the ships are not as important as the victory. Now, let's go forward 35 years. Mikasa's an awesome battleship. I think she's surrounded in concrete now. I can't remember the city, but yeah, I'd like to go see that. But back to my thoughts. So we get to 1941. And again, we see the Japanese fleet approaching Pearl Harbor for a cataclysmic strike on the enemy that will decide the fate of the war in one blow. Now, hindsight's great, isn't it? Because now we can all talk about why didn't the Japanese launch the third strike? Why didn't the Japanese land troops at least and destroy the harbour facilities? And these are good questions. But the main question is that I always ask, how come the entire Japanese fleet wasn't there and just waited for the Americans to come out of the harbour? Because that was Hayachiro's maxim. It was what the whole Japanese big fleet was built on. And at Pearl Harbor, even a cataclysmic victory had not been achieved, the admiral in charge of the fleet, I can't remember who he was, but he turned away to save his fleet. So therefore, if we looked at Admiral Hachiro, he would have tried, because that was not what the fleet was built for. The Japanese fleet was built for that one strategic strike. But their ships were too important to them, more important than the victory, a victory they would never get, and they would never get a chance like that again. So there's one striking dissonance in Jen doctrinal thinking. Then we look at the Japanese themselves, the Japanese army, or actually the imperial. There's madness at every level of Japanese society at this time. In the army, there's that talks about leadership from the bottom. The war in China started by colonels. When are colonels deciding what an army of generals? So this again is a madness. The military structure of command is broken. And Japan still has the insanity to launch into a further war, a wider war with America, with that same command structure, fractured. Which is madness. And all of these things the Japanese could see. And all of them they believed that their martial spirit would overcome. Now, we must be fair to the Japanese and say, my God, what wonderful things they were made. They were building, marvelous ships, marvelous planes, things that by 1930s aero standards and naval standards were far beyond everybody else. When it came to amphibious support vessels and carrier-borne fighters and bombers, well, they were 8 years ahead, 8 years ahead of everybody at least. But then, let's look at doctrine. Now, something that has never really been, there are so many aspects of this war that I find interesting and fascinating that I'll never have enough books on. I've never read enough about it because there's just so many different avenues of interest. But if we look at Germany and Japan, and we look at fighter development. Now, in 1940, the Germans had sent an Me-109 to Japan in 1940. And Japan had sent them a Zero. Now, the Japanese got their Me-109 and a couple of pilots, German pilots, who were there to train them on German techniques and what they'd been learning in Europe. And it seems that the German pilots wanted to actually, how can I put this? Okay. The Japanese, like many other air forces in the world, the Italian and the Chinese, believed in the superiority of the dogfight. So to win a dogfight requires the maneuverability, lightness, tight turns. And if we look at the Zero, it's built for dogfighting. All the Japanese planes built for dogfighting because they never gave up on the idea that it was dogfighting. Now, the dogfighting was the pinnacle of what fighter aircraft should be doing. Now, the Germans didn't play their bloody games. The Japanese kept complaining. Your German is going high, diving down on us and swooping away. And of course, there would have been some communications barriers, but what obviously the Germans were saying is the time of the dogfight is over. It's doctrine now. And if Chenier would have success with his tactical doctrine, dive down, swoop away, it was always going to be a defense, especially the Zero, because it couldn't dive very fast. It would be weak against. This is why P-40s are shooting down Japanese fighters over Burma, because the Japanese are into dogfighting and Chenier is into just tactical doctrine. And and that's one tactic: dive, fire, swoop away. And it's a tactic the Japanese against them, but are still fighting against themselves, saying it's a superiority dogfight. So even though as they are losing planes in the air to tactical doctrine, that is the opposite of dogfighting, they are still insisting on training and all their fighters being top quality dogfighters. And as we know, dogfighting did come back in the Vietnam War, but if you wanted to keep your Air Force in one piece in World War II, dogfighting was what you kept away from. So therefore, we see another level of madness within the air assets of the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army, refusing to embrace reality. I mean, how better definition of madness is there than the refusing to accept reality? Yeah. So far, we've listed the madness. As I said, I'm here to talk about the madness of Japan. And as I said, what have we had so far? We've had the ship building. You're building a fleet for a cataclysmic battle, do or die, and then you refuse to risk the fleet. The Air Force, you're getting shown in combat again and again that the time of your dogfight is over and your planes are weak and it's got to be about doctrine, and you're refusing to see it. Let us continue. Now, for China, and for many of her Pacific campaigns, Japan used conscripted troops from her colonies, Korea and Formosa. Now, on Formosa, all the men were subject to conscription. But they were never treated equally within the Japanese army. It's all racism. For the Koreans, however, they were told, you're now part of the Empire of Japan. They would conscript troops into the army and their wives and sisters into the brothels. Yeah, into the brothels. And then they'll expect those same troops to fight for them. Now, is that madness or is that madness? Do you serve Japan to the death but we've got your mother and sister work in a brothel. And that's the madness of Japan. She can't see how this greater Asian prosperity sphere benefits anybody but herself, which is madness. I mean, how could you do that to a family? But this is what Korean soldiers were living through. It was hell for them. Shall we go on? Now, let's talk about this martial spirit. The martial spirit of Japan. Now, if you've been watching my channel a long time, you would have seen that video I did, Ma Jianshan and the rise of the patriotic, of the volunteer anti-Japanese volunteer armies. Now, at the Nin Bridge, the Japanese military come across an enemy, barely armed, barely trained, but willing to fight to the death. That didn't do him any good, did it? Japanese army won the day. So in the very early days of the war, you could see that no matter how willing you were to die, to sacrifice yourself, you couldn't win. But they use the same doctrine. So they keep that doctrine. They can see it failing in front of their own faces, even as the war goes on, and, suicide by the Chinese becomes an option, and a readily used option. They still don't see it. They still believe, even after Nomenham and the Russians flog them, they reassess, they reappraise their armored corps and reorganize this and reorganize that and try to get some new equipment. But still all believe that if they had that and the martial spirit, they would have won. Because all the officers that survived Nomenham were disgraced. So many of them were driven into suicide. And I mean, some of these officers would have been very heavily decorated in any other army in the world. But they were put into disgrace because they lost. So on one hand, the Japanese army could admit, we don't have the equipment. But it couldn't admit, that the army of the prowess, martial spirit of the Japanese army can fail. We've seen it fail at Nomenham, but they still rely on it for the rest of the war to overcome any problem or obstacle, which is madness. Madness. Then we see the invasion of China, where there are many lessons for the Japanese to learn if they want to learn them. But as I've said, the thing about madness is it stops you seeing reality. So no matter what they do in China, by the end of 1940, they know they're not going to win. 39, most of them knew. And that's why they get crueler and crueler. Because for the Japanese soldiers, they know they're not going to ever go home until this war's over. And as many of them are older conscripts, family and children who are now going to be living in penury on an army wage, just forge some kind of resentment. It's that terrible supplies, horrible logistics, very harsh discipline within the Japanese army. Nobody obeying the orders. Colonels telling generals what should be done, or countermanding, or just doing their own thing, ignoring the orders of generals, and then generals climbing on the same side of the colonels. They just shouldn't bottom up. I mean, how is that possible? So across the Japanese army, for me, all the butchery, all the horrible bastardy that they did was because I believe that no matter what kind of person you are, if you're surrounded by madmen, you yourself will join them. And I actually believe that trying to understand the depravity of the Japanese army in World War II, we could only ever understand the figures. Each invocation is unique in its horror. And for it to come out of the imagination of those soldiers, were they all insane too? There's a whole insane madness running through the Japanese military. They were evil they were evil bastards. And that to me is a madness, a bloodlust. I mean, I mean, we understand that bullies, when you're at school or wherever they are, they've got something going on in their life. That's why they're doing that. Well, these Japanese soldiers have got a hell of a lot going on in their life. Who's going to suffer? If they're suffering, they can't make the guy next to them suffer. They can make the people, the ranks beneath them suffer, but they can make the Chinese people suffer. And they do, without consequence or remorse. So, I could go on. How many points have I said so far, Dave? Is it only me and you? What have we said over here? Ignoring tactical doctrine. Yeah. So what? That's 6 or 7 reasons already that we don't understand. Oh, then that. Sorry, another one. Hey there, other person. Another one is that it popped into me, popped out of my head. Yeah, so Japan's just crazy. It's insanity. The whole country was infected by war mania from the mid-20s. Jingoism had taken over Japan. And I wish I could remember where that thought that popped into my head, but seemed to have gone. To try and understand Japan in World War II, you can say I would never. They're all nuts. That's it. So therefore, how does Japan win in China? That's what she wants in the world. She can't win the war by 39-40. How does she do it? She strikes Pearl Harbor. I'll knock America out of the world, take the colonies in Asia, and that'll give me all the resources I need to finish the war in China and carve out the that I deserve. So there's madness again, isn't there? I'm going to start a war with the West in order to win a war in the East. I mean, there is some logic in that, but not much. Not much. I mean, basically, you're going to widen the war against a stronger enemy to win a war against a smaller war against a weaker enemy. That's madness. So that's about all I'll say on that. But I was glad to get it off my chest. What do you think, Dave? What do you think on that? book. Yeah, that's what I reckon, you know? That's it. Don't try and make sense of it. Okay, bit of a book review now. Now, got this the other week on Amazon, free delivery. I got it the next day. David McCormack. Now, this book, if you are after an introduction to Japanese tanks in World War II, it's not bad. It's not bad. However, if you wanted a deeper look, you wouldn't. This book's not for you. The book, the author hasn't done many military books, and he didn't really look at or take into account Japanese experimental tank formations in China, and the book is very Spartan when it comes to pictures and diagrams. So Osprey do a similar book, and I would recommend the Osprey book. So it's not a bad book, but you could probably spend your money better on the Osprey book because the Osprey book's cheaper and it's got a bit more illustrations in it and gets into it in more depth. Although this book does examine some of the political motivations that Osprey doesn't get into, but I don't think that's worth the extra $15, I suppose. Because like in China in the 30s, the Japanese were doing some very experimental things with tanks, and I will get into it in a further documentary in another video. But let's just say that when it came to deep range armored penetration, the Japanese knew their stuff. What else to talk about? I don't know, Dave. You got any questions? Well, I also want to talk about what I'll be converting. Now, these are the Hat Ottoman artillery set. Great set. This set is the bones for so many of my armies. You think they just needed a good heavy tank? Now, I could show you in another book of mine some of the. Actually, you know what, Dave? I'm going to go get this book for you. Just hang on a sec. I've got to find it in my library. Guys, take two. I've got to find this book, and I'll actually show you some of the designs the Japanese did have for heavier tanks, and you might find them very interesting. Now I'm back. I didn't think you had, but yeah, if you want to see some of the tank designs, now this is a good book. David Lister, Forgotten Tanks and Guns of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Very good book, but this would be. I would buy this book if I was into that game, Very British Civil Wars, because it's something that maybe you could scratch build or field in your armies. But let's go to the Japanese section. There's a good section on them in this book. Just bear with me. What is this book? I've got quite a bit of a library, so and I recently had a mold outbreak in my life, which was quite scary. But I dealt with it. Aha. I think this is getting there. Okay, here we are. So these are some of the designs that were on the cards or might have been built. Let's move that. So that is the Type 97 heavy tank, and she would have weighed 32 tons, armed with 2 cannon and 4 machine guns, with a crew of 6 and armor of 22 to 35 millimeters. So even like a behemoth like that, like that, 22 to 35 millimeters. You've got the book. Good. Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I'll show this for the other guys that might watch this. So then there's the Type 96. So these were Japanese designs from the 30s for heavy tanks that never got built, or some say they might have got to prototype stage on 1 or 2 of these designs. And Type 104 heavy tank, which was their 75 millimeter arm tank. There you go. It's not for you, Dave. It's for the other guy. I can get it straight there. There you go. Oh, you don't. Oh, yeah, it's a great book. It's a great book. So, yeah. So those 3 types of heavy tank that the Japanese were considering making in the 30s, but all of them had problems. You see, because just like you have to have cranes at the docks big enough to get them off. You have to have tanks, train transports wide enough to get them on. You have to have good roads good enough for the truck transport to be able to take the tanks to wherever they were going to go. Look, if Japan had won the war in China, because history is great, isn't it? You can have hindsight. In 1940, she wouldn't have had to attack America, and found that the tanks she did have were sufficient. Because let's be honest, Japanese tanks were good enough up until 1941. When we forget that when the German army invaded Russia in 1941, there were still tanks armed with 20 millimeter guns, short, low velocity, 37 millimeter guns, low velocity 50mm guns. So, and that's the German army. Tanks, the German army, armored warfare. I mean, it's a little hard, we know that, but, that's what jumps into your mind, So the Japanese tanks were good enough. And I always say the Hargo, probably, I always admire the Hargo. I mean, it's a great design for a first-time effort. It's a good performer. The way it was insulated, asbestos insulation made it very unique. It was the Japanese wanted, thinking climate a long time before anybody else was. A lot of people talk about the asbestos lining in Japanese tanks. Oh, it was because they were getting ready for the heat of the Pacific. No, it was because they were getting, there were some of their first tank battles were in minus 30 degrees in the in blizzards. So they took note of that, and they insulated their tanks. And it wasn't just for the crews; it was for the actual engines. Now, it would have been nice if the Japanese had could have said, it would have been nice for the Japanese, not for our allies, but it would have been nice for the Japanese if they could have said, oh, we can make the Panzer V. But I thought wasn't on the cards for Japan. And as we've already looked at too. I mean, I'm not an expert on Japanese armor. I know I can ID all the tanks and a few bits and pieces like that, and probably know a little bit more than the next guy. But really, the Japanese were always thinking, even when they formed tank divisions. I mean, a Japanese tank division, what is it? Three tank regiments or 3 tank battalions. No, 3 tank regiments, and 3 tank battalions. I'm trying to think. I've got one. A Lloyd infantry regiment with half track, 4 half tracks to each battalion, 4 armored half tracks to each battalion, an armored engineering company, totally mechanized in half tracks and tracked vehicles. But the Japanese, even when they've sent that to America to face the invasion to the Philippines, it was -1 tank regiment, because the Japanese, by the time they realized that the true definition of what armored warfare was, they also realized they didn't have the tanks to do it. The tanks weren't good enough to do it. So they still stuck basically to infantry support. And although technology has now brought us back almost to the point where tanks are only infantry support, almost. I'm not saying the day of the tank is over, but the progression and the yin and the yang and the back and forth and the yo-yo between the infantry and the AFV will continue. So yeah, I'm going to and if you've got any questions there, guys, oh, we've got a third person. How are you again? How are you, mate? So yeah, this is, like I said, it's this great book, well worth getting. I wish I knew, as I said, I wish I could talk more about Japanese armor on like more of an academic level, but I can't. I can look at operations and things like that. But even then, like, I don't know if you guys understand this, but when I started reading, and I mean, I've been into the war of resistance for a long time, all my life. Reading what I could, and watching what I could, and learning what I could. And every time, every book gives you another question. So a lot of what I know about are still questions from books that I wrote like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And it doesn't mean that I've found the answers yet. It's just that I've added more questions, perhaps. So yeah, going back to the toy soldiers, these have been the backbone for many of my conversions. The hat, Ottoman, artillery set. The figures are great to convert. You always need true figures, and the guns, they're really good to convert into other things, really handy. So, good set. And that's about it, because I can hear my wife home now. And I'm going to go and spend some time with her. All right, guys, we'll keep wargaming. As I said, I'll get back to some battles when I've got this lot finished. I'm going to spend some time with my wife and get back to painting these. All right, guys. See ya. Bye.